I mean, I don't want it to happen, obviously, but I feel like I can imagine a time in the future where Sony just takes over Bungie, because we did see from Jason Schreier a while ago, he did say that he revealed pretty much the terms of the agreement between Bungie and Sony, and Bungie's or Sony's purchase of Bungie, that if Bungie misses certain revenue goals or targets, that Sony can acquire and fully take over the company, which, taking another 155 employees, or isn't really taking, it's more like saving. That's kind of a part of it, but I can definitely, as much as I don't want it to happen, I can definitely foresee, as far as Bungie putting in money, I can imagine Bungie's revenue is gonna shrink. So I can, at least they do have the safety net of Sony, because they did say that the only other option of being acquired by Sony would have been insolvency, because they were losing money and they were in debt. So they do have the safety net of at least Sony, but of course I'm sure that will come with some other layoffs, and I'm sure employees having to work on just other things at Sony which aren't Destiny or Bungie related. But it definitely does seem like there'll be a future where Sony just ends up taking over the whole company, and then who knows? I mean, Sony, obviously they have good intentions and they can make great games, and they will, I'm sure, do great things with the Bungie talent, but what that means for Bungie's unique identity and what they want would probably be even more diminished if Sony ends up taking over.
I think there's a very weird part to it as well, right? Because Bungie's acquisition has another story inside of it, which was the potential pivot in direction that Sony could have taken and backed away from when they realized what they were doing, thankfully. And it's all about the story of live services taking over the world, right? Bungie's acquisition from Sony is partly because of the IP they were working on, partly because of Destiny, partly because of Marathon, but it was also because of the idea that they were one of the leading live service developers in the world, right? Destiny crowds out other things. They, just in the same way that people referred to WoW killers, they refer to a Destiny killer. And lots of the time, as predicted, Destiny killers are the ones that die. As a result, Sony acquired Bungie and sent them and their devs with some expertise along to other studios who they were trying to force to make live service games as well, so that they could critique them, right? And this results in a whole bunch of stuff like the Naughty Dog story, right? Which is commonly taken out of context for a whole bunch of different reasons. But essentially it was saying like, hey, are we doing a live service game correctly? Forget about anything else. Is it going to resonate? Is it going to hold players? And the answer commonly in a lot of instances was no. Sony quickly reevaluated that strategy after, I'd say, I can't remember whether it was 6 months or a year, and they realized that live services were way crowded out, and that essentially the market was already going to be in this place where it was fully saturated, and that if they just announced all these live service games, they would flop. So they cancelled a ton of live service projects, right? And that was, I'd say, last year or so that really started happening. And as a result, looking at the live service side of things with Sony, it gives me an interesting question about what their direction is with future projects in Destiny, because obviously Bungie is now tied to games as a service and live service. It's also one of those weird moments where if Sony has saved the 150 employees and pulled them into Sony Interactive Entertainment for other things, and if they're now looking at Bungie and what they might be able to do, is it possible that instead they do something which is a little bit like the old school Sony of back in the era of the earlier PlayStation 5 launches and of PlayStation 4, where they just focused on single player games that were rightly considered bangers? And like, granted, that's a perilous path all on its own, because those things are expensive. Like, I don't remember exactly what the exact tagline cost of the latest Horizon game was, but it was not cheap. Latest Spider-Man game, also not cheap. And they sell like hotcakes. Like, they always have bangers, but it's also one of those things of each one comes with an extensive amount of risk. So I don't know. It's an interesting thing now, because I also don't exactly know what Sony's direction is now that they've abandoned the live service path. They were looking for a more sustainable revenue model, but they realized live services are already saturated. So what happens now? My hope is that they can sit there and they can pull Bungie over to a better path, but Honestly, regardless of what happens, there's one unifying point I think we can all sit there and hope for, which is that if Sony does ever eventually take over Bungie, let's shepherd Pete Parsons off that stage and just make sure that he's not a part of this anymore. And I say Pete Parsons, he's the figurehead of all this. It's right that he gets a certain degree of blame as CEO.
It is his job.
But it's more than just him. It's the whole Bungie leadership team. It's the executives that are not in touch with the day-to-day developers. And I'm not talking about individuals such as the head of the narrative team or the, composition lead on the audio side of things, or even the creative directors. No, I'm talking about C-suites. They are not actually helping the process. They're making these big risks that don't pay off. They're taking terrible decisions for company morale in the long run. They're managing the studio terribly. And if Sony is able to take the wheel, the hope is for some, regardless of what the truth of the matter ends up being, for good or ill, the hope is that a new set of hands will actually be able to manage things much better,
Yeah, I mean, it is their job. Obviously, people like mainly Pete Parsons, he's been the main figurehead of a lot of the just distaste in what's going on with Bungie, but it is, his job. And obviously, like, personal attacks and that kind of, the internet can get a bit vicious, but that is a CEO's job. Like, CEOs get paid a ton of money, not just because it's just a fancy made up title, but because they do take the risk. It's their job to make the decisions, and if the decisions are bad, decisions, or in other words, like gambles and bets, which is their job, and most of the time in a lot of companies it can pay off. When they don't go well, then they do get the blame. That's why they're paid so much money, is because you're supposed to be the one making the decisions that leads the whole ship in a good direction. So if the ship crashes into an iceberg, we're going to blame the captain. So that is kind of the downside of being a CEO. Like, yeah, obviously you get paid loads of money and apparently he's buying loads of cars and stuff. But the downside is when things go wrong, you are going to get the blame, which is definitely happening.